Will you testify under oath right now? Do we have operational control, yes or no?
Yes, we do. And
we have operational control of the borders.
Yes, we do. And Congressman,
and
we are working to...
Listen what operational control defined. In this section, the term operational control means the prevention of all unlawful entries into the United States, including entries by terrorists, other unlawful aliens, instruments of terrorism, narcotics, and other contraband. Do you stand behind your testimony that we have operational control in light of this definition?
I do, and Congressman, I think the Secretary of Homeland Security would have said the same thing in 2020 and in 2019.
That's the definition of operational control.
Based upon the definition you have, sir, up there, no.
We don't have operational control.
No, sir.
With respect to the definition of operational control, I do not use the definition that appears in the Secure Fence Act.
Do you admit that your policies have led the country farther away from operational control of the border as defined by the Congress?
Congressman, no, I do not.
If you will recall when you testified here in front of me when I asked that question, when you very clearly stated we do have operational control, when presented with the actual definition of operational control, you didn't hesitate. You said, I do. And you, in fact, then referred back and said, I believe that my predecessors would have said the same thing. You looked straight at the American people, straight at me, straight at every person on this committee, and said, we have operational control. Why?
Congressman, 2 points. One, you did not let me complete my answer. Two.
Hold on. Or give me your second point. Go ahead.
Thank you. Two, the Secure Fence Act defines operational control as not a single individual crosses the border.
I'm aware. I read it, and I read it to you, and you read it, and in fact, you said, I do. You didn't hesitate. You didn't say, I do. I need to explain what I mean by I do. You said, I do, over and over again.
But I want to remind the public and the majority that Donald Trump...
Will the gentleman yield?
I will not yield. I want to remind the public that Donald Trump and House Republicans also have their own ideas for the border. So let's review the majority's border ideas that they've actually presented. Here they are. Donald Trump actually has said that he wants to build alligator moats along the border. That's one of his incredible ideas. Another idea that Donald Trump has promoted is he actually wants to electrify the border fence and maybe even put some spikes on the border. That's another Donald Trump and MAGA majority border idea. Another idea, which I'm not sure how well it would go, is he wants to actually bomb northern Mexico with missiles. That's another Trump idea. And finally, I think one of the ones that I think is the most grotesque is suggestions that instead we should maybe just shoot migrants in the legs as they cross the border. So once again, the Donald Trump and MAGA plan is alligator moats, bombing northern Mexico, shooting migrants in the legs, and electrifying the fence and putting spikes on them. That is the Donald Trump border plan. And so, again, we are here today with these horrific ideas being presented constantly by the former president. This is all about trying to get Donald Trump reelected.
Of the 20 pages in the articles of impeachment, 6 pages of text are solely dedicated to laws Secretary Mayorkas has violated, and 4 pages of text are dedicated to examples of Secretary Mayorkas's lies to Congress and to the American people. Additionally, the article cites 3 different court cases that support certain charges in a Supreme Court case that discusses impeachment as a remedy. It's very clear. Very clear. By willfully and systematically refusing to comply with the rule of law, Secretary Mayorkas is making this country less safe, and the facts don't lie. And we've gone over them over and over on this committee. And we've had witness after witness come in and testify to how the country is less safe and how many people have died.
This, on the other hand, is an impeachment process that you are moving forward because you claim that Secretary Mayorkas, who's obviously working under the direction of President Biden, is failing to secure the border. The irony of the fact that Secretary Mayorkas has spent the last 2 months plus with a bipartisan group of senators negotiating legislation that would address the problems at the border should not be lost on anyone. You are sitting here right now trying to impeach a Secretary of Homeland Security for neglecting his duties literally while he is trying to perform his duties and negotiate legislation. Now, the real reason we are here, as we all know, is because Donald Trump wants to run on immigration as his #1 issue in the November 2024 election.
Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas took a similar oath, but he has not lived up to it. He has willfully and systematically refused to comply with the laws passed by Congress and breached the trust of Congress and the American people. The results have been catastrophic and have endangered the lives and livelihoods of all Americans.
Today, we are being fooled that work is being done against an individual for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The American people understand that that is not the actions that we are here for today. Revenge, vengefulness is why we're here. Otherwise, they would understand that Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas is an individual whose family fled the Nazis and then Cuba before arriving here in the United States. That is what he went through. He is the first immigrant to serve as head of the Department of Homeland Security. And yet, this committee seeks to suggest that he is violating the Constitution, when in essence, his freedom is based upon our Constitution.
Subjected to the characterizations of House Democrats who attack the purpose and the validity of this hearing, who have today referred to it as a waste of time, a sham, a joke, a political game, a policy dispute, and even said that no serious member would pursue these articles of impeachment. In fact, Mr. Chairman, the opposite is true. No serious member could sit in this room and look at the American people and deny the catastrophe at our southern border. No serious member could deny that it is past time for accountability. No serious member could look at the American people and say that lawlessness is acceptable, that it is acceptable for one branch of government to defy the others willfully, purposefully, and with impunity. And that is precisely what Alejandro Mayorkas has been doing all of this time.
I don't tell part of it because the hypocrisy of the people on that side of the aisle has just become so egregious over the course of the day that nothing surprises me. You sit here self-righteously attacking Mr. Mayorkas and saying he's not abided by the law, I guess the immigration and nationality law. He's lied, he's willfully done these things as though he has some personal motive for seeing the cartels bring in more fentanyl. He's broken the law, and that's why we've got to impeach him. So I would ask you, if somebody was accused or indicted or convicted of rape, would you think they broke the law? How about fraud? How about sexual harassment? How about sedition and subversion? And let's don't forget tax evasion. Do you all think those are laws that if you do those things, you've broken the law? Well, of course you have. And yet your candidate for president, who not a one of you have condemned or stood up and said, no, I'm not going to support that guy because he's broken all these laws. I hadn't heard you say it. You're fine to go down the path with him, but you want to attack Secretary Mayorkas for doing the best that he can.
This impeachment, these articles of impeachment present a very narrow question, which no one seems to want to follow the line of reasoning long enough to get to. What the Supreme Court said in United States versus Texas, both the majority and the dissent, is that Congress, 20 years ago, mandated restriction of the administration's prosecutorial authority. In certain specific cases, you will detain and detain until you have removed. And yes, Secretary Mayorkas has brazenly flouted and disobeyed those laws, those statutable laws, statutory laws. He wrote guidelines that said it shall not be a basis to detain anyone if they're in those, just because they're in those categories that Congress declared in law. So that's what's happened over and over again. The articles of impeachment specify 7 separate statutory commands by the Congress that Secretary Mayorkas has similarly flouted and brazenly disobeyed.
Republicans continue using our pain for their political theater. My colleagues say they care about the pain of our communities. I've heard them say it. They care so much that back in January 18th, they brought mothers who lost their children just to parade their pain in front of cameras. Republicans lied to those mothers and told them that Secretary Mayorkas was going to be present during the hearing. Even when they had knowledge that he was not going to be here, he had asked for a date that was agreeable for the committee and him. They knew he wasn't going to be here, but they told him he would be.
Has any Democrat been to the facility in Adelanto, California? Okay, so you haven't actually been to the facilities that have 1,940 bed spaces there, yet only 8 are full. So this discussion, this argument, that there's not enough resources, that there's not enough bed space. I'm going to continue the thought here. It's completely false. That's not the only facility. Let's talk about in 2021 that 4 out of 5 beds at the facility in Tacoma, Washington were empty. Let's talk about in 2021 where DHS spent $12.5 million on a facility in Georgia with unused beds at the same rate. So the detention piece of this argument, the willful refusal to comply with the detention piece of the Immigration and Nationality Act is what we're talking about. That is the law that Secretary Mayorkas has not complied with. He has not enforced. He has not done anything, in fact. And he had the resources, he had the bed spaces, he had the ability, and he didn't do it.
What we're doing here has serious consequences for the Constitution, for our democracy, for the people who are working at the border, who are on the front lines, and all for you to have some kind of political stunt, I think. And as Mr. Higgins will know, he's a fellow Southerner, I think another saying appropriately describes what's going on here, and that's just shoveling the same old shit and calling it sugar. And that's not what the people want us to do. So I yield back.
Partisan Republicans are seeking to impeach Secretary Mayorkas for the following reasons. 1, later this year, United States voters will choose a president for the next 4 years. The presumptive Republican nominee, Donald Trump, is a narcissistic, hateful liar who was found by a court of law to have raped and defamed at least 1 woman. He is currently facing 91 criminal charges for a wide variety of alleged offenses, including a felony conspiracy to defraud the United States. He was twice impeached by the House of Representatives, including for inciting a violent insurrection. He is currently working to foment discord and perhaps a civil war, encouraging Republican governors to order National Guardsmen to take up arms against the federal government. In a fair election, he will lose because the United States people prefer decent, honest civil servants like Joe Biden. Republicans are playing dirty political games, attempting to impeach Alejandro Mayorkas to distract from their own legal and electoral problems, score cheap political points, and appease their cult leader. 2, in the same election, United States voters will choose their representatives to Congress. Republicans are widely expected to lose control of the House of Representatives, in part because court rulings have overturned several gerrymandered maps and returned voting power to disenfranchised citizens. Voters are also witnessing the extent to which Republicans have failed to govern. As Republican members of the House of Representatives have spent far more time fighting with themselves over who should serve as Speaker than on any meaningful attempts to develop bipartisan solutions to problems facing our country. The House Republican majority has accomplished approximately nothing. As Republican Congressman Chip Roy put it, quote, "We have nothing. In my opinion, we have nothing to go out there and campaign on. It's embarrassing," end quote. As Republicans stare down the increasing likelihood of losing their grip on power, they are becoming more and more desperate, grasping at any opportunity available to potentially increase their poll numbers, even if it means pursuing an unconstitutional impeachment based on flimsy pretexts and dishonest twisting of the facts.
Secretary Mayorkas' actions and decisions clearly meet the standard necessary for initiating impeachment proceedings. This historical evidence is overwhelming that the Founding Fathers intended impeachment to be used to deal with the commission of indictable crimes and the abuse of power, corruption, and injury to the nation caused by public officials, among others. At the Constitutional Convention, the framers purposely devised the impeachment power to include any offenses against the nation's security committed by high officials. Stephen Bradbury, former Principal Deputy and Acting Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice, there is a settled understanding beyond dispute that impeachable offenses include both prosecutable crimes and all manner of gross misconduct in office that does serious harm to the U.S. political system or the U.S. constitutional order. The actions, policies, and statements of Secretary Mayorkas easily meet that standard, and the American people completely agree.
Can you clarify what you mean by the analogy that you just said that Donald Trump was Hitler?
Well, when you say that you want to pollute when immigrants are polluting this country, that to me and the blood of this country, that is absolutely reminiscent of things that Adolf Hitler said. And in fact, his imagery, the way he supports white nationalism, the way he supports white supremacy, and those kind of comments are completely offensive to immigrants and hopefully to all Americans in this country.
So just to be clear, you were drawing an analogy between Donald Trump saying he is like Hitler.
I'm drawing an analogy that the rhetoric that Donald Trump uses is very much the rhetoric and the type of rhetoric that Adolf Hitler used.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Because here is the reality. Every single day that Secretary Mayorkas continues in his role, America is less safe. We have ceded control of our border to the Mexican drug cartel, and we have seen the tragic and irrecoverable consequences of doing so. Not only are these articles of impeachment appropriate and based in law, it is our duty to ensure that the United States of America is a nation of law. It is our duty to ensure that our border is secure. And it is our duty to ensure that Secretary Mayorkas faces the consequences of his actions and the consequences of deliberately and willfully creating this catastrophe.
The extreme MAGA Republicans who are running the House of Representatives are deeply unserious people. They don't want progress. They don't want solutions. They want a political issue. And most of all, they want to please their disgraced former president. House Republicans take their marching orders from Donald Trump, who has directed them to reject a bipartisan border bill and urged Republican governors to defy a United States Supreme Court order ensuring the Border Patrol can do its job.
But interesting you say that legislation is the issue. I think I recall the first 2 years, we got to have immigration reform fixed. I think I recall in the first 2 years of this president's tenure, the House was controlled by the Democrats, the Senate was controlled by the Democrats, and the White House was controlled by the Democrats. Why didn't you fix it then? You were in total control. Yeah, it's still messed up. You're right. And what's happened is that the Homeland Security Secretary has said, well, I'm just going to ignore these laws and do what I think. I'm going to take my agenda for immigration because I can't get it passed through the House or the Senate, even when my own party's in charge, and I'll just do what I want. And that's not what the founders intended.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield back.
And any shortcomings that Mayorkas may have, frankly, are your fault. He's asking for authorities to do more, to have more border agents, to have more resources. And so his limitations are caused by you. You put him in place. You won't let him do it.
And I think that at the end of the day, history will definitely define Secretary Mayorkas as the most infamous cabinet member ever for his complete abdication of his responsibility. It is historic. And I think we finally found something we can agree on. And Mr. Correa, I agree. I hope you're right. I hope that at the end of this, the result is change in a positive way. And I think already in this committee, we have seen positive change just today, because for the first time in 3 years, we actually have Democrats admitting there's a crisis. And I will note too, and many of you were not here last Congress, but while we were in the minority, and my good friend from New York City said that the secretary couldn't do his job because he didn't have the resources. Well, that's not what the secretary said. The secretary didn't say that. Secretary Mayorkas came to our committee and he said the border is secure.
They are at capacity. So there may be individual examples of certain facilities at certain times that are not at capacity for safety reasons or health reasons or whatever the case may be. But overall, across the system, we are at and above capacity. And so what should the secretary do? The secretary, because he has not received the funding to provide adequate detention capacity, has to use his judgment for who to detain and who to release. That is not illegal. It is certainly not impeachable, and it is the exact same kind of discretion that every other director before him has used.
We see the number of people who are dying every day from fentanyl. Yes, we're catching more fentanyl coming across the border, but do you know that the leading cause of death for individuals 18 to 49 are drug overdoses, most of those caused by the use of fentanyl, and that fentanyl comes across our southern border? And so when confronted with those facts, do we have a secure border? The answer is clearly no. And the answer is no because this cabinet secretary refuses to enforce the law.
I wanted to just respond, because I know my colleagues don't want me to speak during their time, to a couple of the confusing arguments that I've been hearing. On the one hand, you hear that Secretary Mayorkas should not have changed the policies of the Trump administration. But if he is changing the policies of the Trump administration, that means it's a policy decision, not a violation of the law. Now, you can then argue, as I'm sure you would, that, oh no, it's the policies that are violating the law. But you can't show that any of his policies are actually violating the law.
Second thing that ought to be cleared up, that Secretary Mayorkas was not afforded a proper opportunity to come before this committee, despite his willingness to do so. Well, that's not so correct either, because on 3 separate occasions since August, Secretary Mayorkas was indeed invited to testify before the committee to defend his actions and his lack of actions as Secretary of Homeland Security. In response, his staff either tacitly declined our invitations or engaged in a game of cat and mouse to avoid being accountable for his actions. He never had any good faith to find a mutually agreeable day. He never offered any real times or days to testify. And most recently, on January 5th of this year, Secretary Mayorkas was invited to appear before the committee at our January 18th hearing as a part of the official impeachment proceedings. The Secretary then rejected the offer to testify, and his office failed to communicate with our committee and failed to make himself available to testify at another time. Understanding that his declinations would continue and our investigative duties would be stymied, the committee again offered the Secretary 10 days from the date of January 18th hearing to provide written testimony. The committee has yet to receive a response.
And this impeachment's part of that. We have held 0, I repeat, 0 full committee hearings dedicated to emergency preparedness, cyber threats, infrastructure protection, transportation security, Department of Homeland Security Management, or information sharing and intelligence efforts. With the global dynamic that we have not lived up to our oversight obligation here on this committee because you all are obsessed with the border. because you bend the knee to the orange Jesus, as you refer to him across the aisle. That's what this is about. And we have failed our jurisdiction on this committee. So I'm tired of being lectured. You know, I try to listen here. I try to be a team player. I really do. I try not to engage in the partisanship, but I've had it. I've listened to a lot of accusations here today. We are here on a sham impeachment hearing because of the partisanship of this committee, and enough is enough. Ms. Green asked the American people. The American people are listening. They are, and they're tired of the partisanship of this Republican majority that has failed to get things done.
But if we are going to make excuses for the failures and the broken laws of Secretary Mayorkas, and claim that people are dying in this country, and we shouldn't blame Secretary Mayorkas, we should blame it on supply and demand, it's honestly the most ridiculous thing I've heard all day, and we've heard a lot of ridiculous things. I mean, I've been listening, and it's my time. I didn't interrupt you, it's my time. In the early days of the present border crisis, Gloria Chavez, excuse me, sir, it's my time. I didn't interrupt you. Okay? I'm not lying. You're lying by trying to tell the American people that it's supply and demand, and that's why people are dying. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Fentanyl was involved in 884 adolescent deaths in 2021. In the early days of the present border crisis, Gloria Chavez, then the El Paso Sector Chief Patrol Agent, said, quote, "For the first time, we're starting to see these tactics where fentanyl is being smuggled between ports of entry. They find ways to intimidate migrants and find ways to illegally have them transport that narcotic into the United States." End quote. The cartels overwhelm Border Patrol agents in one sector with a group of migrants and then push more groups and drugs across in another. So I guess don't blame Secretary Mayorkas and the fact that he doesn't follow the law. Blame supply and demand, and that's why people are dying. That's why that the cartels are smuggling narcotics across the southern border. It's ridiculous. Sheriff Skinner, quote, "It's quite frankly a tsunami of death that is crashing into the United States over our southern border. It's killing Americans wholesale, and it's just another epic slaughter, manufactured by the cartels. If you don't secure the border, it's going to continue."
So, you know, I heard the gentle lady from Georgia talk about wanting to stop the human traffickers. I do too. I absolutely do. The concerns that we have with illegal crossings, I am also concerned about the illegal crossings. So my question is, let's be honest. Let's say that somehow the Senate vote, that you get this out of this committee at 5 a.m, wherever we get out of here. You bring it to the floor, and then you get enough votes, right, to impeach, and then you send to the Senate, and let's say that this happens. Then the president has to appoint someone else. What solution have you created? Because here's my thing. None of you ever ask yourselves, what is the root cause of migration? How come 5,000 people are coming through our border? Some of you are mothers and fathers. I'm not one. But I would ask myself, why would a mother be willing to go through Venezuela, into Panama, up through Guatemala, and go through the hell that they go through?
We saw the Democrats call in a congressional expert who said you don't have to have high crimes and misdemeanors. Their own expert in constitutional law says that a cabinet secretary could be breached or could be impeached for a breach of public trust. And I will tell you that that is exactly what we have with Secretary Mayorkas, that he has lied repeatedly to members of this committee. I can count times in which he has lied to questions that I have asked Secretary Mayorkas, where he's lied to questions where Chairman Green has asked him about the border being secured.
The core mission of DHS is to ensure a homeland that is safe, secure, and resilient against terrorism and other potential threats. No one on this dais believes America is safe, secure, or resilient against terrorism or other threats. Just this month, 10 retired FBI leaders and counterintelligence experts who together served under 7 different presidents sent a letter to Congress January the 17th about the dire threat that Mayorkas border crisis has brought to the U.S. They wrote in part, it would be difficult to overstate the danger represented by the presence inside our borders of what is comparatively a multi-division army of young single adult males from hostile nations and regions whose background intend to do damage to America. You think about it, they're not just coming from a couple of different countries. They're coming to America from 160 different countries.
It is a straw man argument to say that Republicans are doing this because Mayorkas has not detained every single migrant in a particular category. And what I endeavored to suggest a moment ago was that the articles, I would ask somebody to point to me the page in the line where it says anything about every single migrant. What it's saying is, of course, there remains, even when Congress passes a law to restrict prosecutorial discretion from being exercised in a certain way, obviously there are certain circumstances where it can't be avoided. So if an administration is doing its best, if the Secretary is doing his best or her best to abide the law, but circumstances prevent it. But when you're reducing the amount year over year that you're asking for detention beds from 54,000, it goes up to 60,000, then down to 32,500, down to 25, those are the requests of the department. They're creating the circumstances under which they are accomplishing what they want to do, which is preventing themselves from being able to follow the law in the main. They're trying to change the categorization of migrants by which they detain or do not detain. That's different than not being able to detain every single migrant. And I can tell you this, if Secretary Mayorkas were trying to follow the law and there were circumstances that were preventing it, there would be a wholly different reaction from this Congress.
We're listening to Democrats today talk about Secretary Mayorkas requesting funding from Congress and talking about detention space. But the facts tell the truth. Secretary Mayorkas has requested less detention space. Fiscal year 2020, $2.7 billion for 54,000 beds, including 2,500 for family units. Fiscal year 2021, $3.1 billion for 60,000 beds, including 5,000 for family units. Fiscal year 2022, he requested $1.8 billion for 32,500 beds. Fiscal year 2023, he requested $1.4 billion for 25,000 beds. And in fiscal year 2024, Secretary Mayorkas reduced it again down to $1.3 billion for 25,000 beds. This is a reduction of 9,000 from fiscal year 23 enacted. DHS has not provided Congress with statutorily mandated reports on detention needs as required under 8 U.S.C. 1368 and requested by the committee in a letter on January 4th, 2024. Also, DHS claims in fiscal year 22 and 23 budget requests that a reduction in detention capacity level will not impede ICE's ability to apprehend, detain, and remove non-citizens that present a threat to national security, border security, and public safety.
The allegation that's being made in the articles of impeachment is that there's a willful defiance of enforcing the law. Justice Kavanaugh, with respect to that point, wrote this: as the district court found, the executive branch does not possess the resources necessary to arrest or remove all of the non-citizens covered by these two statutes. That reality is not an anomaly. It is a constant. For the last 27 years since those statutes were enacted in their current form, all 5 presidential administrations have determined that resource constraints necessitated prioritization in making immigration arrests. All 3 of the Trump nominees to the Supreme Court agreed with this language. None of them supported the position that you just outlined. And it was an 8-to-1 decision. The articles of impeachment rely on Justice Alito's language. He's the sole dissenter in this case. So just based on the constitutional law as explained by the Supreme Court in the case that you cited in the article cite, It comes out exactly the opposite and undermines the claims that somebody could be impeached in the executive branch for following executive authority that the Supreme Court recognizes as theirs, especially in immigration cases, and that's been true for decade after decade.
Just to expand on that, I mean, this goes back to the H.R. 2 debate that we had in March of last year. And I appreciate the fact that many discussions were had on the immigration laws. But the point of this committee is about security. And Ms. Ramirez, I was going to ask you to yield. I hear the push factors. We see them. I've been to the Darien region and took members and invited members of this committee to go with me to see those. Push factors are very real. But the pull factors are also very real. And at what point do we say that on a case-by-case basis, parole has exceeded a reasonable amount? What I think is actually extreme are the 10 million people who have come into this country illegally in 3 years in the administration. No doubt. I've talked to thousands of these people. No doubt there are bad situations going on. But when you look at the parole, just the numbers year by year, 2014, 4,000, 2015, 4,500, 2016, 5,300, all the way in that range until you get to 22, 795,000 people, 23, 802,000 people. That's extreme. That's a circumvention of the law. That is a pull factor in a way that I agree with my colleague from Florida that it was on purpose. And so we're not talking about immigration in this committee, we're talking about security.
Mr. Pfluger, can I
Actually,
respond?
my time has expired.
Mr. Ivey, I'm going to pick on you just for a minute because you're well reasoned. I listened to a lot of your debate, and I think it's I hear someone that's really stepping into what does the law say, what does what does the court proceeding say. And so I took note a while ago when you talked about that the Supreme Court quote has yielded to the executive what to enforce and how to enforce it. And I just step back as someone who does not have a Juris Doctorate. And I think about that. I just think about that statement for what to enforce and how to enforce it. For all of us that know that we did not have a king implemented in our governance, that's really what we're doing when we allow that ideology to be pervasive. To allow the executive on how to enforce it or what to enforce, you've granted them the ability to become a king, and that flies in the face of what all of us. I think that transcends party politics. We taught the Constitution. We do not have a king. And think about what John Adams said. John Adams, that great statement, he said, we are to be a government of law, not of men. What's he talking about? He's talking about the rule of law. Think about what his cousin, Samuel Adams, said, that neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest of laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt. So what we're talking about here, and don't you think it's quite ironic? We're going to go through these procedural hurdles all day long today, and I respect that. You have the right to use the rules and to bog this process down. But we're using the dot and tittle, making sure we adhere to it, and that will be respected by the chairman. But think about what we're doing. We're defending someone who refuses to adhere to the dots and tittles, who refuses to play by the rules.
The question now occurs on reporting the resolution H-Res 863 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McCall.
Aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Jimenez. Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Mr. Pfluger.
Aye.
Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Mr. Garbarino.
Aye.
Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Ms. Green.
Aye.
Ms. Green votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez.
Aye.
Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. LaLota. Mr. LaLota votes aye. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. D'Esposito votes aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Luttrell. Mr. Luttrell votes aye. Mr. Strong.
Aye.
Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen votes aye. Mr. Crane. Mr. Crane votes aye. Ranking Member Thompson.
Nay.
Ranking Member Thompson votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee.
Sad day. No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Payne.
No.
Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Swalwell.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Correa.
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Mr. Carter.
No.
Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Tanadar. No. Mr. Tanadar votes no. Mr. Magaziner. No. Mr. Magaziner votes no. Mr. Ivy.
No.
Mr. Ivy votes no. Mr. Goldman. No. Mr. Goldman votes no. Mr. Garcia. No. Mr. Garcia votes no. Mrs. Ramirez. Mrs. Ramirez votes no. Mr. Menendez. No. Mr. Menendez votes no. Ms. Clark. No. Ms. Clark votes no. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no.
Are there other members in the room who wish to have their vote recorded? How am I recorded?
You are not recorded.
The chair votes aye.
Chairman Green votes aye.
The clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, Chairman Green, it was 18 ayes and 15 noes.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. Without objection, the measure amended during today's markup will be reported to the House in the form of one amendment in the nature of a substitute for the resolution. This concludes the consideration of the resolution noticed by the committee for today.